This is the face of a man who murdered a priest. In a confessional booth. On the holiest day of the year. This is the same man who gutted a young woman alive. Who executed 4 teenagers as they begged for mercy. Who shot a grandmother's son while children played nearby. But if you saw him on the street, you'd never know. He looked like your son. Your neighbor. Your friend. Herbert Mullen wasn't hiding in shadows. He was walking among you in broad daylight. Helping strangers with broken-down cars. Then crushing their skulls with baseball bats. And the most terrifying part? He kept a list. Names. Dates. Earthquake predictions. Because in his mind, every person he butchered was saving California from destruction. 13 human sacrifices in 4 months. And when police finally caught him, he didn't run. He didn't fight. He asked them one question. Don't you understand what I've done for you? The first victim never saw it coming. On a wet Friday morning in October 1972, Lawrence White was doing what he always did, wandering the roads near Santa Cruz, looking for odd jobs or a kind stranger who might help him out. At 55 years old, White lived a simple existence, sleeping under bridges and in the woods where nobody would bother him. He had no family to speak of, just brief stints in the drunk tank and the occasional appearance at the local shelter. He was invisible to most people, which made him the perfect target. When White spotted a young man standing beside a broken-down station wagon with the hood up, he did what any decent person would do. He stopped to help. The driver seemed grateful, explaining something was wrong with the engine. White leaned in to take a look, completely unaware that the friendly stranger was reaching for something behind his back. The baseball bat came down with crushing force, shattering White's skull in an instant. His body was dragged down an embankment and left in the underbrush like discarded trash. When hikers discovered him days later, nobody seemed particularly concerned. Just another transient who met a bad end. No family came forward. No friends reported him missing. The investigation went nowhere. But something had been set in motion that morning. Something that wouldn't stop until 13 people were dead and a community was paralyzed with fear. The killer had a name, Herbert Mullen, and he believed he had just saved California from complete destruction. Just 11 days later, Mullen struck again, but this time the violence would be far more horrific. 24-year-old Mary Guilfoyle was running late for a job interview. Like many young women in Santa Cruz, she stuck out her thumb to hitchhike, despite the warnings everyone had been hearing. The town was already on edge with rumors of missing women, but Guilfoyle was confident she could handle herself. When a small station wagon pulled over, driven by a clean-cut young man who looked harmless enough, she climbed in without hesitation. She realized her mistake too late. Mullen drove to a deserted area, pulled out a hunting knife, and stabbed her repeatedly. But he didn't stop there. In a grotesque twist inspired by his reading about Michelangelo, Mullen decided he wanted to understand the human body the way the great artist had. He opened her up and pulled out her internal organs, laying them beside her body like some macabre anatomy lesson. The blood soaked into his car's floor mat, a stain he would never be able to fully remove. Guilfoyle's remains wouldn't be discovered for months, giving Mullen plenty of time to plan his next move. November brought an attack that shocked even the hardened investigators. On All Souls' Day, one of the most sacred dates in the Catholic calendar, Mullen walked into St. Mary's Church in Los Gatos. He had been raised Catholic, taught to respect the church and its traditions. But on this day, respect was the furthest thing from his mind. Father Henri Tomé, a 65-year-old priest beloved by his congregation and respected as a war hero from the French Resistance, was hearing confessions in his booth when Mullen entered. What happened next defied comprehension. Mullen approached the confessional and began speaking with the priest, perhaps confessing to his previous murders. Then, without warning, he tried to force the door open. Father Tomé, hearing the commotion, opened the door himself to see what was happening. Mullen stabbed him directly in the heart with his hunting knife. Trapped in the narrow confines of the confessional, the elderly priest had nowhere to escape. A parishioner entering the church witnessed the struggle and ran screaming for help, but by the time anyone returned, Mullen had vanished into the afternoon, leaving only fingerprints and the body of a holy man bleeding out in his own church. The murder sent shockwaves through the community. Here was a man who had survived the Nazi occupation of France, who had risked his life fighting for freedom, only to be brutally murdered while performing one of the church's most sacred duties. Civic leaders attended his funeral in droves, and police secretly watched the crowds, hoping the killer might return. He didn't, but Mullen's rampage was far from over. After the priest's murder, Mullen briefly attempted to get his life together. He tried joining the Coast Guard, hoping the military structure might give him purpose. When he failed the psychological exam in December, his paranoia intensified. He became convinced that the peace movement and hippie culture had ruined his life, that people had given him drugs specifically to damage his brain and prevent him from succeeding. His anger festered as he moved back in with his parents, stopping his medication and spending his days brooding over perceived injustices. On January 25, 1973, Mullen decided it was time for revenge. His target was Jim Johnera, an old high school friend who had introduced him to marijuana years earlier. In Mullen's distorted mind, Johnera was responsible for everything that had gone wrong in his life. He drove to a remote cabin to ask Johnera's location from a woman named Kathy Francis, who lived there with her husband and 2 young sons. She kindly gave him the address, not knowing she had just signed her own death warrant. Mullen found Johnera at home with his wife Joan. When Johnera answered the door and let his old acquaintance inside, Mullen suddenly pulled out a gun and screamed accusations. He shot Johnera as the man tried to escape, wounding him. Johnera dragged himself upstairs where his wife was taking a bath, desperate to protect her or perhaps find help. Mullen followed methodically, shooting both of them in the head before stabbing their bodies repeatedly in a frenzy of rage. Their infant daughter was with Joan's mother that day, the only reason she survived. But Mullen wasn't finished. Kathy Francis had seen him, had talked to him, could identify him. He couldn't risk going to prison. He drove back to the remote cabin on Mystery Spot Road, where Francis was home with her 2 boys, 9-year-old David and 4-year-old Demon. The boys were playing Chinese checkers on their bunk bed, their Christmas tree still decorated in the corner, when Mullen kicked open the door and started shooting. Kathy fought desperately to protect her children, struggling against her attacker even as bullets tore through her. But she was no match for Mullen's determination. He shot her in the chest and head, then turned his weapon on the 2 boys as they huddled terrified in their bed. Even after they were clearly dead, he stabbed all 3 bodies repeatedly, his rage driving him to obscene levels of violence. When investigators found the scene days later, the Christmas decorations were scattered and broken, the holiday joy destroyed by senseless brutality. The double murder scene looked like a drug deal gone wrong to police. Both Johnera and Francis's husband Bob were known marijuana dealers, so investigators assumed this was connected to that world. They compiled lists of suspects, rival dealers, and known criminals. But Herbert Mullen's name never came up. Nobody connected the quiet, mild-mannered young man to these execution-style killings. Santa Cruz was now in the grip of genuine terror. The newspapers called it the murder capital of the world. Bodies kept turning up in different locations, killed in different ways with no apparent connection between the victims. Women were disappearing while hitchhiking, some found decapitated. An elderly widow was discovered strangled in her bathtub. Gun sales skyrocketed as homeowners armed themselves, fearing they might be next. Parents kept their children inside. The streets emptied at night, and through it all, Herbert Mullen walked freely among them, planning his next sacrifice. On February 10, 1973, 4 teenage boys made a fatal decision. Brian Card, David Oler, Robert Spector, and Mark Dreibelbis decided to camp illegally in Henry Cowell State Park, building a makeshift shelter from plastic sheets and spare wood in an area they called the Garden of Eden, far from the Rangers' usual routes. They thought they'd found the perfect hideaway where they could live their bohemian lifestyle in peace. Herbert Mullen discovered their camp while wandering through the woods. When the boys invited him to join them, he responded with hostility, demanding they pack up and leave immediately. They were defacing government property, he insisted, and it wasn't fair that they could get away with it when he'd been hassled by a ranger for doing the same thing. The teenagers looked at this scowling stranger trying to enforce rules and laughed at him. That laughter cost them their lives. Mullen later claimed the boys had telepathically given him permission to die, that they had agreed to be sacrifices. But the scene investigators found told a different story. These boys had fought desperately to survive. One had tried to claw his way through the plastic walls of their shelter. They were trapped, and Mullen shot them one by one, execution style, as they screamed and tried to escape. When he was finished, he calmly took their rifle and $20 before walking away, leaving their bodies to be discovered by one of their horrified brothers a week later. The very next day, retired prizefighter Fred Perez was working in his front yard on a quiet, foggy morning, tending to his garden like he did every day. At 73 years old, Perez had lived a full life. He'd fought professionally, raised a family, and was now enjoying his retirement in the peaceful neighborhood he loved. He never heard the car pull up behind him. Mullen raised the rifle he'd stolen from the camping teenagers and shot Perez once in the heart. The elderly man dropped instantly, dead before he hit the ground. Mullen sat in his car for a moment, staring at what he'd done, then calmly backed up and drove away. This time there was a witness. A neighbor heard the gunshot and looked out her window just in time to see the station wagon driving off. She memorized the description and called police immediately. When officers spotted the vehicle just minutes later, they pulled it over. Behind the wheel sat Herbert Mullen, his car filled with firewood he'd planned to deliver to his parents' house, and a rifle covered with a paper bag on the front seat. At the police station, Mullen refused to speak, repeatedly chanting the word silence whenever anyone asked him a question. But his apartment told investigators everything they needed to know. They found newspaper articles about the recent murders, an address book with Jim Giannara's name, and bizarre writings about earthquakes and death rates. Ballistics tests quickly confirmed that his weapons matched several of the unsolved killings. As the investigation unfolded, the true scope of Mullen's crimes became clear. This unassuming young man had murdered 13 people in just 4 months. A homeless drifter, a college student, a priest, a family with 2 young children, 4 teenagers, and an elderly man in his own yard. The victims seemed random, connected by nothing except their terrible luck in crossing paths with Herbert Mullen. But Mullen insisted there was a pattern, a grand design behind everything he'd done. When he finally started talking, the story he told was perhaps more disturbing than the murders themselves. He claimed he had heard voices commanding him to kill, that his father had telepathically ordered him to commit these murders. More incredibly, he insisted that every victim had agreed to die, that they had offered themselves as sacrifices to prevent a massive earthquake from destroying California. Mullen explained his bizarre theory to anyone who would listen. He had been born on April 18th, the anniversary of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that devastated San Francisco. It was also the date Albert Einstein died. In Mullen's mind, this meant he had been chosen for a special purpose, that it was his duty to perform ritual human sacrifices to prevent natural disasters. He had studied death rates and earthquake patterns, convincing himself that human deaths prevented geological catastrophes. By killing people, he believed he was saving millions of lives. The story of how Herbert Mullen arrived at this twisted logic begins long before the murders, in what appeared to be a perfectly normal childhood. Born in 1947, Mullen grew up in a stable, middle-class Catholic family. His father was a World War II Marine veteran who worked for the post office. His mother was a typical housewife of the era. There was no abuse, no trauma, no warning signs that their son would become a killer. Young Herbert was bright and sociable, an excellent student who played varsity football despite his small size. He had a steady girlfriend, plans for college, and was voted most likely to succeed by his high school classmates. Everyone who knew him expected great things from Herbert Mullen. But then something changed. In the summer after graduation, Mullen's best friend Dean Richardson died in a car accident. The loss devastated him, sending him into a spiral of despair and obsession. He built shrines to Dean in his room and spent hours alone, wondering if his friend's death had been some kind of cosmic sacrifice. He began studying Eastern religions intensively, searching for answers about death and reincarnation. This is when the first signs of mental illness began to emerge. Mullen started experimenting with marijuana and LSD, common enough for young people in 1960s California. But for someone with dormant schizophrenia, these drugs can trigger psychotic breaks. His behavior became increasingly bizarre. He would stare at people with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. He talked about impending earthquakes and claimed he needed to move to Canada to escape them. His longtime girlfriend became frightened of him, especially after he began getting violent and told her he thought he might be gay. His family watched helplessly as their promising son deteriorated before their eyes. In 1969, while visiting his sister, Mullen began mimicking his brother-in-law's every movement and word for 4 hours straight, a symptom called echopraxia that can indicate schizophrenia. His family took him to a mental hospital where he voluntarily committed himself, but he was released after a short stay. Over the next few years, Mullen cycled in and out of psychiatric facilities. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia multiple times, but in the early 1970s, California was systematically closing down mental hospitals. Long-term care was expensive and difficult to access. Mullen's parents desperately tried to get their son help, but without money for private treatment and with state hospitals shutting down, there was nowhere for him to go. He would be admitted, observed for a few days, then released back onto the streets where he would stop taking his medication and deteriorate again. During this period, Mullen moved to San Francisco's Tenderloin district, living in decrepit hotels among drug addicts and alcoholics. He took up boxing, training at a local gym where his coach described him as determined but strange. He would spar intensely, never giving up even against superior opponents. But if left alone, he would stand in the corner talking to himself as if carrying on a conversation with invisible people. His writings from this time reveal a mind unraveling. He filled hundreds of pages with incomprehensible ramblings, drawings, and theories about earthquakes, death rates, and cosmic significance. He wrote about the 12 apostles plus one, clearly positioning himself as a messianic figure with a divine mission. When he discovered that Albert Einstein had died on his birthday, April 18th, it became further proof in his mind that he had been chosen for something important. But was Herbert Mullen's schizophrenia really to blame for his murders? This question would become central to his trial, which began in July 1973. The legal system has always struggled with how to handle mentally ill defendants. Just because someone is diagnosed with a mental illness doesn't automatically mean they're not responsible for their crimes. The legal standard for insanity is whether the person understood the difference between right and wrong at the time of the offense. Mullen's defense team argued that their client was clearly insane, that he genuinely believed he was saving lives through his murders, that he heard voices commanding him to kill and thought his victims had telepathically agreed to die. They presented evidence of his extensive psychiatric history, his bizarre writings, and his delusional belief system about preventing earthquakes. The prosecution took a different approach. They didn't deny that Mullen was mentally ill, but they argued he still knew what he was doing was wrong. They pointed to how he had tried to hide his crimes, cleaning blood from his car, picking up shell casings, grinding serial numbers off his gun. If he truly believed his actions were justified and righteous, why take such care to avoid getting caught? They also noted that Mullen had admitted to ignoring some telepathic commands to kill, showing he had control over his actions. During the trial, Mullen insisted on testifying, which shocked everyone. Most defendants, especially those claiming insanity, don't take the stand. But Mullen was determined to explain himself. He stood at the witness box and delivered what observers described as a lecture, explaining his theories about reincarnation, earthquake prevention, and the conspiracy against him involving his family, friends, and teachers. He blamed his father, claiming the stern Marine veteran had telepathically commanded him to kill. He blamed the peace movement for giving him drugs that damaged his brain. He blamed hippies and flower children for ruining his life. He even asked that his father's fingerprints be compared to every unsolved murder in California and Oregon since 1925, convinced he would prove his father was the real mass murderer. The jury listened to weeks of testimony from psychiatrists, investigators, and Mullen himself. They saw a young man who was clearly disturbed, who heard voices and held bizarre beliefs. But they also saw someone who made choices, who knew murder was wrong even if he believed he had good reasons for doing it. After 3 days of deliberation, they reached their verdict. Herbert William Mullen was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 8 counts of second-degree murder. The jury decided he was mentally ill but legally sane at the time of the crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2025. The case raised troubling questions about mental health care in America. After the trial, the jury foreman wrote an open letter to California Governor Ronald Reagan, holding him partially responsible for the deaths. He pointed out that Mullen had been diagnosed as dangerous by psychiatric professionals 5 times before the murders, but the state's systematic closure of mental hospitals meant there was nowhere to keep him. If Mullen had received proper long-term treatment, 13 people might still be alive. Reagan dismissed the criticism as a psychiatric mistake, insisting the state wasn't dumping mentally ill people onto the streets. But the evidence suggested otherwise. California's mental health system had been gutted, leaving families like the Mullens with nowhere to turn when their loved ones needed help. Within a year of Mullen's trial, legislators passed a bill prohibiting the closure of any more mental hospitals, though the damage was already done. Today, Herbert Mullen remains in prison, now in his 70s. He still maintains that he was following divine orders, that his family and society conspired against him, and that he should be released. He shows no real remorse for his victims, still convinced that he was performing a necessary service by killing them. The tragedy of Herbert Mullen is complex. He was a young man who showed enormous promise, struck down by a devastating mental illness at the age when schizophrenia typically manifests. His family tried desperately to get him help, but the system failed them. At the same time, Mullen made choices. He stopped taking medication. He chose violence over other options. He selected vulnerable victims and showed planning and cunning in his crimes. The 13 people he killed were innocent. Lawrence White, just trying to help a stranger with a broken-down car. Mary Guilfoyle headed to a job interview. Father Henri Tomei, serving his congregation. Jim and Joan Johnera, surprised in their own home. Kathy Francis and her 2 small boys, murdered simply because she gave directions. 4 teenagers camping in the woods. Fred Perez, tending his garden. Each had their own lives, families, dreams, and futures that were violently stolen from them. Santa Cruz has never forgotten those terrible 4 months when fear gripped the community and death seemed to lurk around every corner. The case of Herbert Mullen stands as a dark reminder of what can happen when mental illness goes untreated, when warning signs are ignored, and when a broken system fails to protect both the afflicted and their potential victims. Was Herbert Mullen born to kill? The evidence suggests not. He was born with the genetic predisposition for schizophrenia, a devastating illness that would destroy his promising future. But millions of people suffer from schizophrenia and never hurt anyone. The combination of untreated mental illness, drug use, isolation, and a failing mental health system created the perfect conditions for tragedy. In the end, the question isn't just what made Herbert Mullen kill. It's what could have been done to prevent it, and what we can learn to ensure it never happens again.